Welcome to segment 2 of show 18. So, CT, can newspapers get customers to pay for their content?
Generally, I don't think so. I think if you're a really awesome newspaper like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, if you find the right price point, you might be able to pull it off. I think the majority of newspapers, for what they are, especially the local ones, they don't have enough of a unique selling proposition to pull it off because it'll just take one local newspaper to not play ball and the rest all have to follow. What's interesting, though, is now Sun Media, and I came across this story thanks to Mike Mataloni on Twitter at The Hot Iron, that Sun Media is going to start a metered paywall. I'll read a quote from it. Online subscriptions will be $1.99 per 4 weeks. Digital-only subscriptions will be $6.99 every 4 weeks. And I thought that was interesting because you can pay an extra $2 a month to get access to online. I think that's a mistake. I think right there, if you're going to pay for a subscription, you can get access to the content online. And as for $7 a month for online access, the tier difference is interesting. I don't know if people would be willing to pay $7 a month. And I know that sounds ludicrous, but I think it'll depend on a paper-by-paper basis.
Is there anything unique about stuff they publish? Is there any author that you're like, oh my God, I would pay for this guy? I think that's the challenge of newspapers.
Well, that's just it. And newspapers used to compete that way with columnists, but now if you're a columnist with a lot of balls, you can just start blogging on your own, and next thing you know, you're getting paid $5,000 to go speak somewhere, and you don't care about being a journalist anymore. You can just be an op-ed guy.
Okay, so a few things worth mentioning. The Wall Street Journal is like the worst example to give for newspapers that are successful at charging because the Wall Street Journal you can expense, by and large. If you read the Wall Street Journal,
that's true.
Your company's going to pick up the tab. So, it's like, I'm sorry, that's not the selling argument for me. New York Times, I think, is an institution. So the New York Times being able to have some success with their paywall, I think is just a testament to the fact that it's the New York Times. But what's funny with the New York Times is before, things go in cycles, always. So you had a period where the New York Times was like free, and then they realized that's not going to work. So they had their paid...
No, they could have made it work.
No, but hold on.
If anyone could have made it work, it was
Yes,
them.
yes, but my point is early on, because then they hit the NASDAQ crash, and for a few years, ad money wasn't there. So then they put a lot of their top writers, Tom Friedman, whatever, behind a paid wall, and that aggravated the journalist, because the journalist is like, listen,
I want my audience.
I want my audience. I don't care about your profits. So they were like, what the hell? And, there was a lot of, during the Iraq War and the whole Bush scandal du jour, a lot of people were like, great article by Tom Friedman, but you can't effing read it because it's behind a paywall. So it got to that issue where, we need to be relevant and we want to be the voice and we want to be like the influencers. But if only a select few are paying to read this content, then what's going to happen is you won't be the leading voice. You're going to have the bloggers and all that. So then they went again with free. And then it was great. Now it's 2008, 2009, 2010. And then they realized, okay, long term, we're screwed if we don't have some kind of balancing act between free and paid. So now they have whatever subscription service that they have, and for all intents and purposes, it's working to the extent that there are a lot of people signing up for it. And then you hear over the pond where you're like, The Economist is bragging about we have 1 million consumers, and whoever. There are going to be cases, isolated or just pretty normal, like the big names, the big institutions, where they are going to be able to command some kind of paid rate. However, I think by doing that, you render yourself somewhat obsolete by the next generation. If you take a look just as a little parallel world, let's say GigaOM. GigaOM launches, they have GigaOM for more initially telco and internet and all that, and then they launch new TV for video. And then they themselves start writing deeper reports, and then they start charging that. So what percentage of their audience is going to pay for that? Probably very low. But ultimately, look at TechCrunch. TechCrunch started to blog, one dude blogging. It then goes on to sell for 20, 30 million bucks. Yet Business Week ended up selling for $1 or $1 million or 2 million because it was all this liabilities, right? So I just think you're going to see this pattern where the traditional media companies, it's typical innovator's dilemma. They do have to defend their business, and revenues can't just come from advertising, but they're ensuring that they will be pretty much redundant within a decade. And again, what's funny is I think American newspaper groups, when I talk to them, at least off the record, because now the executives there, their own kids, they see the writing on the wall, and they themselves aren't online guys, they get it. They know that print is dead. That's the key. They might not want to pull the plug on print overnight. But they actually know now. They're like, and we're doing this and that because print is dead. They'll actually say that, and you're like taken aback. Oddly enough, in Canada, it's like they don't really get that. Like there's a famous quote from Warren Buffett. He's like, if you had the internet, there's no way that you'd be like, hey man, let's like go chop some trees, hire some trucks, take the lumber, print this paper, hire a bunch of,
No, but we have a lot of trees in Canada, so we like to cut them down.
We have a lot of trees, and in many ways we're like the most backwards business country ever, which is fine. But the problem is we still see a very big difference between American companies that, as much as they might be reluctant, they get the writing on the wall, and then Canadian companies that the Globe and Mail paid Transcontinental, one of the world's largest printers, nearly $2 billion for like a 18-year deal to print shinier newspapers, basically. I went to the launch party, great, sitting there drinking, having snacks, and I'm like, I feel like I'm on the Titanic. They're basically just moving chairs around. I'm like, did they actually sign an $1.8 billion deal for shinier newspapers?
I wonder how much of that, though, was a bad business decision and how much of it was nepotism. Transcontinental owns a lot of publications. I've seen them pull a lot of that kind of thing in between publications. And let's face it, you've been doing business with them for a long time. They probably traded a few execs back and forth here and there, and that kind of thing's going to happen.
That's possible. But ultimately, I just think, the big question now is with the iPhone, with the iPad, what I like, we talked about Jan Wenner last week and Wenner Media's decision to not drink the Kool-Aid with the iPad and that it's not necessarily going to be the salvation of newspapers. I do think, though, that content is increasingly going to be either promotional, as in you give it away for free to promote a person, place, or thing, or it's commercial, that it's very like, Avatar or HBO, and 99% of the content in the world is going to be free, unpaid, because there's good enough content out there.
And free content can work in a niche, and I think that's what the internet has taught us about content in general, is newspapers, you had your front section, your sports section, your art section, and so on and so forth. Why? Because you actually had to print enough stuff on a piece of paper to make it worth it to deliver it to someone's house or deliver it to the newsstand. Well, now that we don't have to deliver the physical product, it doesn't make sense to lump all these different things together. It actually makes sense to focus on a single niche. The reason why the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal can get away with charging was, as you said, the Wall Street Journal, people can expense it. That's kind of their target market. The New York Times is the New York Times. But local newspapers, they don't offer anything. Actually, they don't have a competitive advantage there, but where their competitive advantage is that they're local. So sure, it makes sense for them to pick up stuff off like the Associated Press Newswire, but what they should really be focusing on is owning their local territories. And if they did that well, I think they can
not a money. Local,
Hold on. I think if they did it well, they could actually sell advertising properly.
Maybe. I mean, look at what Tim Armstrong and AOL is doing with Patch. I mean, local is a tough nut to crack. Local is like the B2B of yesteryear, where you think it's this like moneymaker and it's really a money pit. Just to go back to sports.
Well, then tell that to Groupon.
But that's different. Okay, perfect. You set it up perfectly. This is why we should go on the road together. I think content only makes sense when you're using it to promote something and then you make money from something else. Amazon is an e-commerce play, like Groupon is an e-commerce play, but Groupon makes sense local because they're actually selling e-commerce. You see what I mean? Amazon is one of the biggest publishers of content, both user-generated comments and all the bios and profiles that they have, but that content drives a transaction, right? So I think, like talking about now jumping back to sports and news, both very timely kinds of content, but sports is not a commodity, news is a commodity. As much as, that great shot of the guy, who is taking his shoe and throwing it at Saddam Hussein or George Bush, whatever, as much as that's great and all that, it's still a commodity, it's still, news is basically a commodity. So, you think you can make money, and most of the news is tough to monetize through advertising anyway, because nobody's going to run a pre-roll before a plane hitting, a building or something. But with sports, at least, it's very unique, it's timely, and it's not a commodity.
It's a safer bet.
So I think ultimately, it's like Seth Godin in his latest article. He's like, the pyramid of content. You have bespoke, you have mass, you have free, blah, blah, blah. Ultimately, if you're producing content, understand that it's a cost of goods sold. It's a marketing expense. So the ones that can create the best content for the lowest price, like the objective is best content, constraint is minimize the cost. If you can nail that magical art meets science, challenge, you're going to win long. But at the end of the day, content, don't expect people to pay for it.
Well,
Hate to be the bearer of bad news.
I think the fact that people, and apparently they still do this, the fact that people used to write into their local newspaper a lot shows that if you're smart about your local content, people will engage. And I think if you can get that level of engagement and using stuff like Facebook Connect, you can get enough data from them that you can really custom advertising enough to actually make it worth sense. At that point, you need a technological component. Either we need a tech ad targeting company that can offer these kinds of publications a cheap solution, or these companies got to develop it in-house, which doesn't make sense. And I think that's why they haven't really gone anywhere yet. And on a quick aside, I think something that people should try going digital only on a very local level, police gazettes. You know, police gazettes from back in the day, it's super sensational stuff. It's probably the kind of local news that people are interested in the most. No one cares about corruption in City Hall. Everyone cares about gangland slayings. You just might be able to pick up enough traffic off of that to monetize it effectively. So maybe a police gazette with a small, like, actual real news section.
What the hell do you read in your spare time? Final point, you mentioned tech. You're right. That's why New York Times is saying, you know, we're going to make our first acquisition in a few years, and it's probably not going to be a content deal. It'll probably be a tech play because they think shiny new object that we could add to our content will make a lot of money.
Well, their content's not broken. Their delivery or their distribution system is.
Well, their model is broken. It's not the content. We're going to take a short break, come back with lightning round and the email of the week.